Some of the coverage in the United States seemed to either blame the Israeli football team or not mention that this was in the context of anti-Semitism. So you wouldn't know from the headline and maybe a couple graphs, which is all people read in many instances, that this was, as you say, a pogrom against Jews. And Jews had to plead that they were either not Jewish or, in essence, recite some kind of pro-Gaza message to spare their lives. What explains that? Why do people do that?
Oh, I mean, it's even worse than that, actually. It's not, there actually is a preponderance of evidence that this was a pre-planned attack. These were gangs of mostly Dutch Moroccan immigrants and maybe some Dutch Turkish immigrants and children of immigrants, Dutch Moroccans and Dutch Turkish people who were gathering at, they had planned this. They had maps of like what hotels these people were staying in, which exits to use. And this was, it was organized also by taxi drivers. I mean, there's like a big paper trail for this.
Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. Israel, anti-Semitism, Jews have certainly been in the news for the last year or so since October 7. But the problem that was surfaced, namely the endemic nature of anti-Semitism and the ignorance about Jews, is as old as Judaism itself. And it is, I fear, a problem that is not going away anytime soon. I was minding my own business and came across a piece in the Atlantic Monthly written by a woman, Dara Horn, that took exception with Holocaust education. And her thinking was so provocative and so interesting, I started reading more of her. And I realized she had written a book by the title, People Love Dead Jews, Reports from a Haunted Present. And it's an important topic for Jews and for non-Jews. And it, I think, also has a bit of a silver lining. And that is that what we fear is widespread malice may be closer to widespread ignorance. And there is an opportunity, I hate to use the cliche, for a teachable moment. So in that spirit, I hope we all learn something. And I've invited the author of that book and those magazine pieces, Dara Horn, to be with us. Welcome to the show, Dara.
Thank you for having me.
My absolute pleasure. So you wrote a book with a very provocative title, People Love Dead Jews. What did you mean by that?
Yes, well, so this book came out in 2021. It was my sixth book after publishing 5 novels, so this was a bit new for me. Although I do write a lot of nonfiction for other, for various sources, but this is my first nonfiction book. People Love Dead Jews is a book about the role that Jews play in a non-Jewish society. And the premise is basically twofold. The first part of it is that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. And the flip side of that is that living Jews often have to erase themselves in order to gain public respect. I can tell you just one little anecdote that appears at the start of the book so that your listeners can understand the frame that I'm working with here. This is a story I tell that happened at the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam in 2018. That museum is, of course, where a young Jewish diarist Anne Frank was hiding with her family and other persecuted Jews during the Holocaust before they were captured and murdered. That building is now this blockbuster museum in Amsterdam. It's probably the top tourist site there. They've got millions and millions of visitors every year. And the story, it was a news item that I had read in 2018 about a young Jewish man who was working at that museum, and the museum would not allow him to wear his yarmulke to work. That, yarmulke being this small skull cap that religious Jewish men often wear. Museum would not let him wear it to work. He appealed this decision to the board of the museum. The board of the museum then deliberated for 6 months. And then finally relented and let him wear his yarmulke to work. And I had read this news story and I just thought, 6 months. is a really long time for the Anne Frank Museum to ponder whether or not it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. And it actually even gets worse than that, because then I was looking into this news story, and I found it's a very similar news story from a few months earlier in 2017, where visitors to that museum had noticed something odd about the audio guide display, where it's a big international museum. They have, I don't know, 15 languages for their audio guide, and there's that place where you pick up or download your audio guide, and it has that chart where it says all the languages, and it says English, and there's a British flag, Francais, there's a French flag, until you get to Hebrew, no flag.
Oh my.
Yeah, and I mean, I read about this, and the museum has since corrected this, but what was interesting to me about this is I'm like, these are PR mishaps, but they're not mistakes.
Yeah.
And they really sort of illustrate this attitude, and as I put it in the book, people love dead Jews, living Jews, not so much. And I will tell you that, this story is from several years ago, but I was thinking about this, of course, in recent days. We're recording this now in the middle of November, and it was about a week ago that there was this basically a pogrom in Amsterdam,
Yes.
with people chasing down and attacking Jewish fans for a soccer match there. So I was thinking about this again. I'm like, and this is literally down the street from this blockbuster museum where visitors are lining up by the millions to pay homage to dead Jews.
And to your point about erasing Jews, some of the coverage in the United States seem to either blame the Israeli football team or not mention that this was in the context of anti-Semitism. So you wouldn't know from the headline and maybe a couple graphs, which is all people read in many instances, that this was, as you say, a pogrom against Jews. And Jews had to plead that they were either not Jewish or, in essence, recite some kind of pro-Gaza message to spare their lives. What explains that? Why do people do that?
Oh, I mean, it's even worse than that, actually. It's not, there actually is a preponderance of evidence that this was a pre-planned attack.
Mm-hmm.
These were gangs of mostly Dutch Moroccan immigrants and maybe some Dutch Turkish immigrants and children of immigrants, Dutch Moroccans and Dutch Turkish people who were gathering at, they had planned this. They had maps of like what hotels these people were staying in, which exits to use. And this was, it was organized also by taxi drivers. I mean, there's like a big paper trail for this. Yes, and as you say, some of these were the news stories basically were like, oh, it was a clash, between fans of different teams, which it wasn't, and then it was these Israelis were chanting racist things, which is remarkable because that's the one element of this story that's not newsworthy, because there's never been a soccer match in Europe ever that hasn't involved fans chanting racist things. I know nothing about soccer, but apparently, unfortunately, that's a huge feature of soccer, and that's the most remarkable thing. But this was in fact not a response to fan behavior. It wasn't drunken fans getting into a brawl. This was an organized attack. So, as you say, why is this ignored? There is a baseline assumption that really all of us in Western cultures are operating from, which is assuming that Jews are collectively evil until proven otherwise. This is something that's so embedded in our culture. I don't know how deep you want to go into this.
Yes, that's what this is all about, and what I write about, and what I agonize over, and what I've written about in connection with October 7, which we will get to. And by the way, listener, this was written years before October 7, as if there was not enough.
Yes, this book, I put this book out in 2021. Obviously, wrote it in the years prior to that. I was writing about this before it was cool. Sadly, now
exactly.
It's cool.
But please go on. There is an embedded assumption that they either deserve these things or they are a nefarious force in society, and people say, "But that was a religious prejudice. We're not religious. We're a secular society now. How could that be?"
Oh gosh, there's so much to unpack here. Okay, so
yes.
Okay, I'm going to start with the historian, and this is something I write about. I've written about this more recently in some pieces I published in the Atlantic, but not. It's not. This part is not in the book. The historian David Nirenberg published an amazing book about 10 years ago called Anti-Judaism. I think the subtitle in one version was The Western Tradition, and then later it was History of a Way of Thinking. And in that book, his premise is that Western societies, and the way he interprets that is very broad. It's pre-Christian, ancient Mediterranean world. It includes Christianity. It includes Islam because of Islam's relationship with Judaism. It includes post-religious societies, to go to your point. Post-Enlightenment and then 20th century societies. His claim is that these societies have defined themselves through their opposition to whatever they call Judaism. And I'm putting this in air quotes, Judaism, because of course this has nothing to do with the actual content of Judaism and everything to do with whatever these societies are hoping to overcome. So the idea is that basically anti-Semitism is a fight for the righteousness of your society's ideals. And basically that is whatever Jews represent, whatever you're fighting against. So, if it's a capitalist society, Jews are communists. If it's a communist society, Jews are capitalists, right? If it's a society that vilifies nationalism, then Jews are chauvinistic nationalists. If it's a society that celebrates nationalism, then Jews are rootless cosmopolitans. If it's a racist society, then Jews are an inferior race. If it's an anti-racist society, Jews are, of course, the worst racists. And basically, so what you see is anti-Semitism is really structured on a lie. The lie is that and it takes many forms, right? We can think of all the lies that confront us now in anti-Semitism, whether it's Holocaust denial or conspiracy theories, the blood libel, all these current claims that Zionism is settler colonialism, right? Or Jews are not somehow magically not native to the land of Israel. All these kinds of things. All of these are basically they're smaller versions of what I would call the big lie, which is that Jews are collectively evil and have no right to exist. So what everyone is coming into these conversations with is an assumption that whatever Jews are doing is evil and that Jews somehow deserve whatever they get. And that's how you see these kinds of assumptions being made about Jews that you may not see with other groups.
And as you said, it makes no sense because Jews are simultaneously all powerful and rootless. They are simultaneously very wealthy and very poor and a drag on society. Every contradiction is included within this because it's an all-purpose expletive. It's an all-purpose bogeyman for whatever is going on in society.
Well, it's actually even deeper than that. And to go to your question before you asked about, it's not is it
Right.
religious or something? First of all, I would clarify that Jews are not a religion. And I know that sounds crazy because, in this country, we think of it's like, oh, Judaism is a religion, Christian, there's Protestantism, there's Catholicism, there's Islam, but I'm often asked this when I speak a lot on college campuses, are Jews a religion or Jews a race or Jews a nationality? And Jews actually predate all of those categories. Jews are actually a type of social group that was common in the ancient Near East and is very uncommon in the West today. It's a joinable tribal group with a shared history, homeland, and culture. And what I said was a paragraph in English, and in Hebrew, it's one word that's 2 letters long, So, Jews are Am Yisrael. So, but to go to the thing you said before about, is it religion? There's actually, and just to go to your more recent question, it also functions, anti-Semitism functions through this permission structure where we're always, it's always it's always advocating for whatever is righteous in that time period. And so there wasn't, of course, an earlier time period where what was righteous was to frame this as Jews are opposed to whatever our religious tradition is that we hold so sacred, right? So that's when you have, in Christian societies, that Jews killed Jesus, right? Or some, Jews are, desecrating the host at communion, whatever, like those kinds of things. Or in Islamic society, that Jews are, defiling the word of the prophet or whatever, those sorts of things. When you have that losing its cachet, what you said is like, oh, it's religious. Actually, it's like already does that. There's already a shift away from that in the 19th century, where then it moves to this sort of racial anti-Semitism, right? And that was sort of the revelation of, after in the late 19th and early 20th century, of course, that leads to, the Nazi movement and things like that, which are, very explicitly not rooted in the, in the religious traditions. It's a shift. And it's based on, because that's an era where science is the most important thing, right? And so then you have, I could take it to the current era, but there's, different points at which you have a set of priorities that you feel are like, this is the most important thing in the world, and so we're going to define it so that Jews are violating that thing.
Now, The flip side of this is the fetishization and the idealization of dead Jews. And you wrote a very provocative piece in Atlantic criticizing the way the Holocaust is represented in museums and taught and used in public education. So, talk first about the phenomenon of fetishizing dead Jews, and then a little bit about your column specifically and the category error you think that's being made in terms of public education and Holocaust education.
Sure. Well, so I mentioned before that the premise of my book, People Love Dead Jews, is people there's this erasure of living Jews. Right, there's stories about dead Jews that make you feel good about yourself, and then there's an erasure of actually living Jews. Both of those things, actually, there's a foundational idea under them, which is that non-Jewish societies only find Jews acceptable if Jews are powerless,
Yes.
whether that's politically impotent or dead. So that is the acceptable frame in which to be Jewish. So yes, I published this piece in the Atlantic, actually also before October 7th. It was earlier in 2023, and this was a piece called "Is Holocaust Education Making Anti-Semitism Worse?" It made a lot of people hate me, and as you know, in journalism, we call that starting a conversation. So for this piece, I traveled around the country. I went to schools. I went to museums. I met with people who create the curricula for schools. I met with people who design museums. I met with state legislators who pass these mandates. I went to teacher conferences. I talked to students. And it was kind of amazing to me what I observed in this sort of deep dive, which was that Holocaust education was being used as a case study in morality. It was completely extracted from Jewish or even any kind of Western history. And it was taught as this, basically a stand-in for public morality, where the moral of the story is you have to be nice.
Yes.
And it was sort of amazing. And the only way that story works is if you remove all history and you pretend that Jews only exist between 1933 and 1945, and anti-Semitism only exists between those periods. And then you basically have, you make it so that Jews have no agency. So that's the story that people like to hear. And it was just amazing to me to sort of see that, you go to all these museums and, the total erasure of living Jews, to the extent that I remember docents in the Dallas Holocaust Museum telling me, I was there for a teacher conference, so I didn't meet students in that museum because I was there in the summer with teachers. Other places I followed students around, but in this museum, I remember talking to the docents and I said, what do students typically ask when they come through the museum on their field trips? And they said, you know what they ask? They ask, are there still Jews alive today?
Oh my.
Because if you came to this museum, you wouldn't really know. And, this is also this case study in morality was kind of shocking. And you immediately see how this is not the way we treat any other aspect of history. Right? I mean, if you go to the African American History and Culture Museum in Washington, D.C., that museum doesn't stop in 1865. It also doesn't even stop in 1965. And also, there's not this idea that we're going to take the story and generalize it to the rest of the world and turn it into a morality tale that flatters us, right? Because in all these other museums I went to, not so much the Holocaust Museum in Washington is a little bit different, but a lot of these museums, there would be after the main exhibit, which of course ends in 1945, there are no Jews after 1945. And then you would go into some interactive exhibit about how, what are you doing to stop hatred? What are you doing to take a stand in your community? These sorts of things, which is a very earnest idea. But then, I realized that imagine if the African American History Museum in Washington, D.C., imagine if the museum's exhibit stopped after 1865. And then after 1865, you walk into this exhibit that's an interactive exhibit about how human trafficking is still happening today. What are you doing to take a stand against human trafficking?
Yes.
I mean, imagine how incredibly insulting that is to the Black history.
Yes.
And to the agency of Black Americans in shaping this country and shaping their own community's destiny, and also shaping the destiny of this country. It would be incredible. No one would ever dream of doing that.
Yes. And so what is happening, just to kind of listen back to it, is that museums, in this effort to make themselves, I'm going to be the general the most generous interpretation, in order to make themselves more relevant, or in order for people to extract some kind of lesson, de-Judify the Holocaust
Mm-hmm.
and make this a story without a past and without a special Jewish identity, and therefore make it a story that you shouldn't hate people, or if you're going to be really generous, a generic story about just discrimination, people who are different than you. And by doing that, they not only have robbed Jews of their one part of their identity. The Holocaust, of course, is not the totality of the identity. And by the way, that also has become a problem that Jews
I don't even consider it part of Jewish identity, frankly.
Right, exactly. That people say, oh, the Holocaust, that's what Judaism is about, and that's what Israel is about, they say, which is a central problem.
Yeah,
But,
unrelated, actually.
but in doing so, they blur the unique evil that the Holocaust represents. They minimize the Holocaust. They make it like other mean things that people do. And so it both de-Judifies it and reduces its importance, but it makes people feel better at the end because you too can prevent hate in your neighborhood, or you too can prevent, another tragedy going on someplace in the world. Is that
So,
kind of where you're at?
well, there's a couple pieces here. First of all, yes, I mean what I see in this is, and I actually wrote about this in a different piece I published recently. I think that what this sort of non-Jewish culture has done with the memory of the Holocaust is, in a lot of ways, consistent with what non-Jewish cultures have frequently done with Jewish experience, which is this massive cultural appropriation of this Jewish experience. I mean, you could think about this like very abstractly. Like, I mean, the church did this for thousands of years, right? We're the new Israel,
Right.
right? We're the new, like, all these stories in the Hebrew Bible, they really happened to us, right? I mean,
Right.
Islam did this, right? There's a lot, I mean, that pattern of like, we take a Jewish experience, we say it happened to everyone, and then we're like, why are there actual Jews here? Like, they ruined the story, right? I mean, that aspect of it. And also, as you say, like, I mean, this is, there's this like defining genocide down, right? Where
Yes.
suddenly
Yes.
it's like, ethnic cleansing suddenly counts as genocide. I mean, all these sorts of things, right? But that bothers me less than this. What it really does is absolve people of anti-Semitism, which is itself endemic in that erasure of Jewish identity. And not Jewish identity of like the Holocaust belongs to the Jews, but the erasure of Jewish identity in terms of this celebration of the Holocaust, of the people who were victimized in the Holocaust, who are most just like you and me, so to speak, right? So you have the valorization of somebody like Anne Frank, who's a person who didn't speak a Jewish language, wasn't particularly connected to Jewish culture. 85% of the people murdered in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers. That was the civilization that was destroyed in the Holocaust.
Yes.
Was Yiddish-speaking European Jewish civilization. Nobody cares about that, right? So that's one piece of it, but also what it does is destroy any ability to understand how people are still participating in this anti-Semitic culture, because they don't realize that even that erasure of saying, oh, we're going to take a generic idea about how to fight bigotry, where we're going to say, see this group of people over here, you shouldn't hate those people, because it turns out they're just like you and me. They're just like everyone else. The problem with this from the point of view of Jewish culture is that Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everyone else. Right? I mean, I think I say this in the book, uncoolness is Judaism's brand.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this kind of goes back thousands of years to the ancient Near East. Everybody else is worshiping their Marvel cinematic universe of sexy deities, and the Jews are like the losers in the school cafeteria with the bossy, unsexy, invisible God, right? Like,
Yes.
like the whole, like one of the whole premises of Judaism is this, like, is being a counterculture.
Yes.
Right? There's a counterculture that is, not bowing to tyranny, not bowing to dominating empires. That is like, and that's, the persistence of Judaism in the face of these dominating empires is not unique, but unusual in world history. And I'm like, the Nazi project was not about just murdering 6 million people who were just like you and me. It was about erasing Jewish civilization. And I look at these way we're teaching about this, I'm like, why are we participating in this erasure?
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the things that you also touched on is that it defines anti-Semitism as the Holocaust.
Yes.
Therefore, oh, it's not so bad. What? This isn't like Nazi Germany, they say, as if that's a validation for attacking Jewish students on campus, for writing swastikas on, Jewish shops, for editing Jews out of diversity programs. That by setting the bar so high and not explaining this within the tradition of anti-Semitism, it really lets people off the hook now, and in fact allows a great deal of anti-Semitism. Hey, unless it reaches the level of genocide, you're okay. You're doing your part.
Yes, I mean it's right. It was. I mean, everybody can. That's why I said people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel good about themselves. Like you go to a Holocaust museum, you hopefully feel terrible about what happened, but you feel great about yourself because you're like, I would never do this, and it's like, yay, you get a medal for not shooting people into a mass grave. 10,000 people a day, right? Good for you, right? And
Right.
yeah, like that is I mean that the idea that that's the standard, and I can say that facetiously, but as you say, like now we have like all these debates about parsing, like, oh, is this anti-Semitism?
Right. Right.
Is this anti-Semitism when someone's throwing rocks at a Jewish student, and it's like, well, they yelled "Free Palestine" while they were throwing a rock, so I guess it's not anti-Semitism. It's
Right.
like, how is it? I mean, it's like you literally need to be yelling "All Jews must die" and be a white nationalist in order for it to count as anti-Semitism.
And when you do, and when you say from the river to the sea, which means eradicating Jews, that's not even good enough, because maybe the person doesn't know what they're saying, or maybe they just mean Jews would voluntarily move.
Oh yeah, I mean,
It's
totally fine, right? I mean, or like globalize the Intifada. It's like I mean, this. I don't know if we want to get into this. I was participating in this sort of ill-fated anti-Semitism advisory committee to the now former president of Harvard, who
yes,
unfortunately
along with my good friend David Wolpe, who
Yes.
also left it. Yes,
Yep. Unfortunately, they didn't really take a lot of our advice. I could say more about that, but we were talking about this, and they're like, oh, we're really worried about free speech, and like not a single person on this committee had any problem with free speech. And we have to play this game where and I'm like, yes, people can shout "globalize the Intifada" all they want. This is a racist slogan, and in this country, people can yell racist slogans as often as they want. And and it's sort of like oh well, what does it really mean? Word Intifada just means uprising. I'm like, that is 100% true. The word Intifada just means uprising, just like the word Sieg Heil just means hail victory, and a Confederate flag is just a symbol of the South.
right.
Right? Like, it's like, yeah, all those things are true, but like, yes, people are allowed to be, to express their racism as much as they want. But like, the bigger question is like, why is Harvard filled with screaming racists?
Yes, and why do certain racists get punished and other racists don't? Or why do certain racist groups get charters and the people that they are victimizing get nothing? So let's talk a little bit about October 7th, since this was such an appalling example of everything you have written about and spoken about. So we start with October 7th. I spent the good part of the following weeks and months trying to get international organizations, American media, to acknowledge that Jewish women had been raped and mutilated. And the level of denial, the level of dismissal was remarkable. Well, we don't have evidence. We have bodies, we have eyewitness accounts, not good enough. Well, we don't know if it was organized. Well, we have tapes of the terrorists explaining that it was organized, and they came with lists of things to do. Not good enough. Over and over again, facts become irrelevant because the rape and mutilation of Jewish women in some way can't be recognized as itself an atrocity. Then we move to the Jews had this coming because they're colonial oppressors, and factually wrong, historically wrong, whatever. And then we move to the conduct of the war, in which Israel certainly must be held to the same standards as other countries, but no country is held to the standards that Israel is held to. So it seems to be all parts of your theory and your work all crammed into one horrible year and a half of the most grotesque anti-Semitism and erasure and denial that we can come up with. But based on our conversation, I am guessing you were not surprised because you knew all this going in.
I mean, I think the magnitude of this attack was surprising to everyone.
Yes.
Obviously, including, people in Israel who were, caught, who unfortunately, were not prepared.
Yes.
So I think that, I'm not going to say that I had some kind of amazing insight to predict this, but
no, but I'm talking about the reaction to it.
Less about the attack than about the responses to
yes.
it.
Yes, that's right.
And especially in Western democracies like ours. Perhaps, although, obviously the response to this in non-democratic countries was, even better than that, right? Exactly. People spitting on bodies in Gaza, awesome. Yes, this very much illustrates my point, although I did have some readers who were sort of cheeky and me like, look, people don't even love dead Jews. Like, okay.
Okay, thanks.
But
thanks.
Hamas loves dead Jews. I think that this really does illustrate, you see how there's this, people are coming in with this assumption that Jews are collectively evil and have no right to exist. And they don't even realize they have that assumption. Right. That's how deep this is. It's like fish swimming in water saying, what's water?
Right.
Right. And when you realize, like, yes, they're literally making you, and it's funny, the thing with, as you said, with this, the mass rapes of Jewish women, first of all, so familiar from Jewish history.
Yes.
I'm not even just from the Holocaust, but I was thinking of things like other attacks in the Muslim world, like in the Farhud in Iraq in 1940, massive, very similar to the attack in, this was like a massive pogrom in Baghdad in 1940, which was, where, it was like hundreds and hundreds of Jews were murdered and mutilated and maimed, and the same kind of these like ghastly gang rapes where people were, tearing off people's breasts and whatever. Very similar descriptions to the Hebron massacre in 1929 in, what is now, in Israel and the West Bank. But this was, and this was an ancient Jewish community that was, this was not part of actually the sort of, wave of modern Zionists who, came to what's now Israel. This was actually a community that existed before that was, very religious people who were living in this, what's considered a holy city. Those attacks were really familiar from Jewish history. Even going back to the Roman occupation, you have these kinds of descriptions, in Ukraine in 1648, you have these descriptions. If you read, the histories of these attacks, it's so familiar. But like you say, the assumption is that Jews cannot, that are evil. And you're coming in with that assumption and you don't even realize you have that assumption. And so you're holding Jews to these standards that it would never occur to you to hold to anyone else to. I think that's so obviously the pattern. And as you say, like the way that, the way the war is being waged, for example, I think when you look at, when you look at, let's say, that it's being called a genocide, right?
Yes.
I'm like, it's a war. It's a war. It is not a genocide. It is a war. Because if the Israelis had wanted to commit genocide, there would be no one there. It's sort of like this crazy, it's sort of this astonishing thing. It's like, if you wanted to commit genocide anytime in the past 75 years, you would not have a population that is now quintuple what it was in 1948. So this is sort of an astonishing, this kind of, or even, I think it was John Spencer, who's an expert on, urban warfare, who's at West Point. He was in Gaza, sort of following these operations. And he was like, this is actually setting a new standard for urban warfare that the American military has never met. Right. Where they're actually jeopardizing their own soldiers in order to protect civilians. They're putting their own soldiers in harm's way to protect civilians. It's actually an astonishing, it's kind of an astonishing way of waging urban warfare. Now, that's not something I know anything about, but that's to me, you see exactly the same pattern. And what you saw, as you said, in your work with these, women's organizations and international bodies, and their refusal to recognize atrocities committed against Jewish women. And, this is very familiar from the 20th century and people's attitudes toward the slaughter of Jews. It's
Right.
obviously very familiar.
Right. And of course, the collective responsibility. Every Jew in America is responsible for the policy choices of the Israeli government, whether the person is a Zionist, whether the person knows anything about Israel, whether the person has any influence, that all Jews are both rootless and stateless, and yet intimately connected and responsible for every bad thing that happens or that they think happens because of another Jew. And that is why we got into these ridiculous arguments about, well, this Jewish deli, had an Israeli flag, so he's responsible. Actually, not.
Of course, you see how everybody is, spray painting, every Chinese restaurant in America with "Free the Uyghurs."
Yes. Yeah.
And how everyone is, beating up Russian Americans on the street and just, clobbering them with flagpoles, right? So it's just a natural thing. I'm like, no, it's
Yes.
in fact not.
Yes.
It's not normal
Yes.
it's not normal to commit actually criminal activity against minorities. And in fact, when people do that, we call that racist.
Yes.
Right. I seem to remember this happening with the whole campaign against Asian Americans during COVID. Right. And
yes,
that was correctly labeled as racism.
Right. Right. So we come back to the phenomenon that is literally as old as Judaism. And the answer, other than revealing it to what it is, remains, which is this insoluble? Is this unimprovable? Is there anything in terms of public awareness, public education, reframing that would reduce, or is this just simply the continuation of 3,000 years of Jewish history?
So part of Jewish tradition is this belief in free will and that nothing is actually inevitable.
Right.
While, yes, I would, you're not going to have great betting odds on betting on the end of anti-Semitism. But I absolutely feel that there is a lot that our society can do. I will tell you that since this book came out, I've spoken around the United States about this topic. And what's been sort of, dismaying to me is the responses I've gotten from Jewish readers, because every Jewish reader in America has to tell me their own horror stories of things they've experienced, sort of anti-Semitic attacks that they personally have experienced, even all the way up to, physical assaults and things like that. So I get to hear everybody's horror stories. But what has actually I found really interesting is the responses I've gotten from non-Jewish readers. I've discovered that this country is actually filled with a whole lot of people with a whole lot of goodwill.
Yeah.
Who really want to be, in today's language, good allies, and, maybe really don't know how. My non-Jewish readers' most common response to this book is, how can I help?
Right.
And, this is a real opportunity. I do feel like there's so much more ignorance than malice. As I said, I speak at a lot of college campuses, and I often will have students who are, not heckling me to the point where they're shutting down the event and that kind of thing, but people who will just, ask hostile questions.
Yes.
And it's been shocking to me how it's actually not that hard to turn these people around.
Right, because they are so ignorant about.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, they are so ignorant.
Exactly. There's just, they know absolutely nothing. And so, someone will say something like, isn't Zionism genocide? And I'll be like, you mentioned Zionism, let's talk about it. And then, sort of explain, I'm like, Zionism is actually a 19th and 20th century national movement that's exactly the same as hundreds of other national movements that arose at the same time period when empires are crumbling. Every single empire gets partitioned into nation states. In every single case, there's massive violent population upheavals that happen as these nation states emerge, right? Yes, this happened in the formation of the State of Israel. It also happened in the formation of 22 Arab states, all of which have now zero Jews after having, cities like Baghdad were 25% Jewish.
Right.
Tripoli was 25% Jewish. Right? Now, how many Jews live in Libya today? Zero. How many Arabs live in Israel today? It's 20% of the population.
Correct.
But also, this is very simple. This is the same thing that happened in the partition of India.
Yes.
Right. Same thing happened in Greece and Turkey. Same thing happened then, Eastern Europe. Same thing happened in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. Like this is like Zionism is actually a very typical 20th century movement, and we basically here in the 21st century we get to decide what we want to do with this legacy. All you need to do is like give them a very small amount of information, and people are like, "Huh, I never thought of it that way."
Yes.
So yes, I do think that that there's an opportunity to reframe certainly education. And I think that the way that has to be reframed is by actually teaching Americans who Jews are, because Jews have been completely erased from certainly, any kind of public or private school K-12 curriculum. There's zero education about who Jews are. The best you get is maybe they learn about that Jews are people who died in the Holocaust, and then that's like, oh, Jews are Europeans, because the only thing I learned about them was that they died in the Holocaust, right? Or, oh, Jews are a religion, because that's what I heard somebody say. And that's literally, then they're like, why does a religion need its own country? Well, first of all, there's many, many Muslim countries, there's many Christian countries, but also Jews are in fact not a religion, right? Let's explain this. So there's sort of like just so many things that there's so many opportunities to educate people. Yeah, and I do think, and there's a lot more ignorance than malice. And yeah, like I said, this country really is filled with a lot of people with a lot of goodwill who really do want to be good allies. And then the other piece of this is a lot of the sort of activism that we've seen in the past year, I don't think is particularly organic. I do think a lot of it is being manipulated by overseas terrorist organizations. And the reality is that most Americans, no matter what their politics, are not really interested in supporting federally designated terrorist organizations. And think that's something that all of us as Americans can get behind.
And by the way, there is litigation over this. There is circumstantial evidence that literally the Hamas playbook came out on October 8th before the war started. So the notion that this is financed overseas and really manipulated, it is not any leap of logic. And frankly, those pre-printed signs that appeared very quickly were not evidence of an organic movement. This was a well-financed, well-thought-out propaganda campaign.
I mean, then the other thing about that is, when you go talk at these, certainly in my lifetime, when you think of any other American protest movement, you talk to somebody who's in that rally or on that picket line, you ask them, so what are you here for? Why are you here? They'll talk your ear off about why they
know.
Yes. I mean, not just they know, they're fired up and passionate to tell you. They want to talk your ear off and tell you all about it. This is the only time in my lifetime I've ever seen an American protest movement, supposedly American protest movement, where you go to talk to someone on the picket line, you're like, why are you here? And they're like, go talk to that guy in the yellow vest. He's the one in charge.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's just, it's so, it's just so bizarre. It's not, it doesn't fit the pattern of an actual, an organic protest movement.
And I will say something, whatever people's politics are, I was extremely gratified that on October 7th, on the anniversary, you had the president and the vice president of the United States, and you had politicians at all level observe this as a Jewish tragedy and not do and we have an Islamophobia problem as well. It was sincere. It was Judified. The president appeared with actually one of the two rabbis from my shul, Rabbi Alexander. It was taken as a Jewish event. They at least gave us that they took this as a tragedy for us, specific to us. And I'm not sure. I fear that in 100 years, it will also be one of these lessons of, oh, look, you shouldn't be mean to people. But at least for now, they preserve this as a uniquely Jewish experience and one deserving of our horror. And that, in a funny way, gave me hope and impressed me.
Well, I think that, look, I think it should be a bipartisan issue to be against the massacres of October 7th. Yes. I would like to think that is a bipartisan thing we can get behind. Like I said, I think we should all be able to get behind, not supporting federally designated terrorist organizations, which, by the way, are still holding Americans hostage.
Yes.
Americans hostage. right? I
Yes.
mean, I think you did, and I mean, if you think about, Hezbollah, I mean, if you think about the number of Americans that have been slaughtered also by these terrorist organizations,
Yes.
this is, to me, is an American issue. As you said, that was, in that moment was, sort of preserved as this is a Jewish tragedy or atrocity against the Jewish people, which it absolutely is and was. But I think that there's a broader, reason for, everyone in this country to care about this, which is that, this is, you're really
Yes.
fighting against these tyrannical regimes.
Exactly. Exactly. So, do you have another book in the works? Are you going to go back to novels? What's next for you?
So I do have a book coming out in March. It's very different from my other books. It's actually a graphic novel for children.
Fabulous.
Yeah, it's a book with a Passover theme. You can actually already buy it online. It's called One Little Goat. It's about a family at a Passover Seder where they can't find the afikomen, which is this piece of matzah that's hidden, and then the children have to hide it and find it during the Seder, and the Seder has to ceremonially ends with the sort of retrieval of this hidden piece of matzah. This family, they can't find it, and so the Seder, they're trapped at the Seder. It can't end. They're trapped there for 6 months.
Right. Oh,
So,
that is every child's nightmare and
yes,
memory of the quote endless Seder at my
yes,
grandparents' house or
yeah.
wherever they was.
So
That
and then
is just
and again, it becomes like a surreal story because 6 months in, there's a knock on the door, and the one of the children answers the door, and there's a talking goat at the door, and he says, "I'm the scapegoat. I'm the reason for your problems. I can help you find this piece of hidden matzah." And the kid's like, "Great, where is it?" He says, "Not where, when." He says, "Over the past 6 months, while your family's been trapped at this Seder, thousands of years of previous Passover Seders have accumulated underneath your Seder, kind of like an archaeological, like an archaeological dig, and you have to go down into these previous Seders to find this pizza matzah." And so it becomes sort of this journey through Jewish history.
oh,
So
fabulous.
yeah, so it's a lot of fun. And I got this amazing indie cartoonist Theo Ellsworth to illustrate it, to work with me on this, and so it's, I'm really excited about that. That's coming out in March. I am working on another nonfiction book, which is because so many people have come to me in this past year, asking me this horrible question, so what's your solution to this problem? And my totally tasteless reply is, did you want me to give you the final solution to the Jewish question?
Yeah.
That is the title of my next book,
Oh my gosh.
although the subtitle is A Love Story for the Living. And this book doesn't exist yet. I'm still working on it, but it's basically thinking about like ways, as like your last question, like, is this
Yeah.
inevitable? What do we do about this problem? As people who want to preserve an America where pluralism matters, and where we have a lot of different diversity in every meaning of that word. So thinking about that more broadly, I am also started. This hasn't happened quite yet, but I'm starting to think about starting my own organization also, and sort of promoting some of these ideas of how we can think differently around education, and educating a broader American public about who Jews are, and about how to understand these kinds of problems.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you so much for coming on. I
No,
will look for the new book and all of your new ventures, and hope to see you again soon.
thanks so much for having me.
And that was Dara Horn. She certainly had a lot to say, and certainly got us thinking, I hope collectively, but me in particular, about the way in which anti Semitism is so embedded and so unconscious that it colors much of what we do, even when we are trying collectively as a society to be responsive and to do the right thing and to teach people about the greatest genocide, which was against the Jewish people. And I think what I come away with is that we have to be authentic, meaning if we think that the Holocaust is a great example for other peoples, other events, then we have to really do it justice and understand what it was. It's not just a symbol, it was an event. It was specific to a group of people at a certain period of time and comes within the continuity of Jewish history. And it's only when we understand that and we understand its present incarnations that we can begin to address the world's oldest hatred, which is anti-Semitism. If you understand it in all that context, the reaction to October 7 is not any more acceptable, but it's certainly understandable. And you realize that that too is in the tradition of anti-Semitism and assuming Jews' guilty role in whatever event is going on. But I also come away somewhat encouraged. We did have, as I mentioned, a president and a vice president and many elected officials of both parties recognize that as a uniquely Jewish tragedy that happened to the Jewish people, in which innocents, and I stress this, innocents, who had done nothing to provoke this, were slaughtered. And that simple recognition, I think, is the beginning for where we should begin discussions. And it was a good model. It was a good example for how you understand an event, preserve its importance to a single people, and get the rest of society to understand exactly what it was and what it means to that group of people. Just as we demand that people understand the central role of racism in American history, and that it was embedded and continues and remains, we should also understand and recognize that anti-Semitism throughout Western civilization, and probably non-Western civilization as well, is part of a continuum and is embedded. And it's only when I think we can have frank discussions about what is being said, who is being said, whether we are treating like things like and different things differently, that we can make any progress on this. And one of the things that obviously deeply, deeply disturbs me and will, I think, get worse in the following years is we've elected a president who surrounds himself with white nationalists, surrounds himself with anti-Semites, was helped achieve re-election by a man who operates a website that has become a sewer of anti-Semitism. And what will that do? What kind of permission structure will that bring about? Will we be looking back at this time as the good old days when things deteriorate further, when we have episodes on the streets of this country like they did in Amsterdam? I pray we don't. And I think Americans of goodwill, and as Dara said, there are many Americans of goodwill, have to make a conscious decision that they will not accept this. They will not accept the normalization, the dummying down of anti-Semitism, and in whatever way people can, whether it's checking out of Twitter, now X, whether it's speaking up when someone in your midst makes an anti-Semitic comment, whether it is rebuking a politician who makes an incorrect assumption or an association that has anti-Semitic underpinnings. It's up to us. There is no, pardon the expression, savior in this. And unless we take it all seriously, it's not going to change. So this was certainly a break from our usual political debate and dialogue. And I think it's important to do that. In the age of Trump, we can't forget about what else is going on in the world, what else is important, what universal values and problems we have. It's not all about Trump, and it can't be. So although it was a serious topic and a somewhat depressing topic, I really enjoyed this opportunity to talk to Dara and to bring her ideas to all of you. And so, once again, we reach the end of a program. If you like this program, if you think your friends, relations will like it, please tell them. They can follow us, subscribe to Jen Rubin's Green Room, wherever they get their podcasts. And you can find me on social media now at jenrubin.bluesky.social. See you soon.